Hello, and welcome to Denton's Tales of the Viking Age. In this video, I'll be looking at Ireland in those times, and at the considerable influence on and the lasting legacy in this country left by the Vikings, forming a significant part of Irish history, impacting almost every aspect of life in Ireland, and later combining with Gael, Norman, and Saxon to produce the Ireland of today. The year is 795 AD. The place is either the island of Lambay, lying just off the east coast of Ireland near present-day Dublin, or Rathlin Island, which is much further north off the coast of Antrim. It isn't quite clear which, since the Annals of Ulster use a word to describe it which could mean either location, but it doesn't really matter which. The event itself is what is important, not where it actually occurred. Strange ships have appeared off the coast. Long, narrow ships with a single large sail and a bank of oars. Ships that almost seem to ride on top of the water rather than in it. Colourful round shields are hung along the sides, and on the high prows are ferocious-looking heads of dragons or sea serpents. These ships bear no resemblance to the trading or fishing vessels that frequent the little coastal towns and villages of Ireland, though by now they are a very familiar and most unwelcome sight across the water in Britain. They have come from the far north, from the lands of Scandinavia, principally Norway and Denmark, sailing first to the Shetland Islands, where they settled, and then to the Orkneys, establishing another settlement there. From there they have sailed around Scotland and down the Irish Sea, landing on the Isle of Man and founding another settlement, and they are now turning their attention to the west, to Ireland. And they have not come to trade or fish. No, they carry no nets, nor boxes of cheap trinkets to offer the natives, no amber or exotic furs to exchange for goods. They carry swords and fearsome axes. The Viking Longships, the fearsome dragon ships, as they will become known, have arrived, bringing with them the most ferocious and finest warriors of the early Middle Ages. So, it's 795 AD, and the Vikings storm ashore on Lambay, or Rathlin, loot the church there of its valuables, and then burn it, along with the other buildings, quickly returning to their ships and putting back to sea, thus setting a pattern for events to come. Now, these attacks on churches and monasteries as principal targets are often seen as indicating that the pagan Vikings hated Christianity, and they were trying to destroy it, wipe it from the face of the earth by attacking religious institutions. But that, like a lot of history, isn't really the case. While they had little love for the Christians, despising them as weak, the turn the other cheek, love thy neighbour ideas of Jesus seeming, well, very lame against the strength of Odin or Thor, who would have bashed your cheek in instead of turning theirs. But by and large, the Norse weren't really interested what other people believed in, as were most pagans. They didn't really care, just as long as those people didn't try to make them believe in the same thing. Christian attempts to convert them in the early days, usually ended badly. But as to the raids on religious sites, most of the wealth in Christian lands was held by the church. The monasteries and the churches were filled with gold and silver objects and precious jewels, to say nothing of the jeweled vestments, chalices and crucifixes, and monetary donations from wealthy patrons, or even poorer people, hoping to buy a front seat in heaven, you might say, by giving offerings to the church. And monks and priests were among the few people who could read and write in those days, making them very valuable captives who could be sold as slaves. So, of course, that is where Viking raiders went. Why raid a penniless fishing village when there was a wealthy monastery nearby, full of gold and silver, offerings of coins, jewel-encrusted artifacts, expensive garments, and valuable slaves to be had? Just as a burglar today targets the house of an obviously wealthy person who has valuable jewellery, top-of-the-range things like phones, laptops, and the like, rather than breaking into a run-down, dilapidated dwelling with a few raggedy curtains on the window that clearly contains nothing of value. Had Jews or Muslims had all the valuables at the time, well, the Vikings would have raided synagogues and mosques and ignored Christian religious buildings completely. So we would now see them as hating Islam and Judaism instead of Christianity. In 798, they returned to the east coast, raiding the petty kingdom of Briga, which corresponded to the modern-day counties of Meath, Louth and Dublin. And another raid takes place in 807, this time on the Atlantic coast, in Connaught. Further raids occur on the west coast of Ireland, including the monasteries of Inishbofin in Galway, Inishmurray in Sligo, and the Skellig Islands. Also in 807, Roscam in Galway Bay was attacked. And a slave raid took place in 821, when a great many women were abducted from Howth, near Dublin. Bangor was attacked in 823, and the monasteries of Clonfert, Birr, and Clonmacnoise in 842 AD. The Irish annals actually name some of the leaders of these early raids. Soxalfur in 837, in which year 60 longships sailed up the rivers Liffey and Boyne, carrying 1,500 men and travelling a considerable distance inland. Thurgester in 845, a man who established forts deep inland on Loch Ree, Loch Ney, and Loch Lean, an island in the latter still bearing the Latinized version of his name, as it happens, Turgesis Island. And he sacked the wealthy monastic settlement at Clonmacnoise once again. And then there was Håkon in 847 AD. In the late 10th century, there was even a fleet under the command of a woman, one the later Irish annalists referred to as the Red Maiden, who is said to have been even more ferocious than most of the men, and regarded by the Irish as one of the most dangerous of the Viking leaders, her savagery greater than that of the men. Though that may have been a tad exaggerated, of course, for propaganda purposes, but it does tell you something about the Red Maiden, I think. And also that raiding and fighting wasn't confined just to men. There are at least 2 historical accounts of female raiders commanding their own ships, as well as references in the sagas that show the concept of females picking up a weapon and fighting in battle, for example, was accepted. The coastal raids intensified, as did attacks that took place far inland, with monastic sites, of course, being the favourite targets, such as Glendalough, Clonard, Lismore, Monsterboice, Ferns, Kildare, Clondalkin, Slane, and in 852 AD, Armagh, the religious capital of Ireland, was destroyed. The Vikings' superb shipbuilding skills gave them this ability to reach inland areas very quickly, more quickly, in fact, than infantry could have done it, since with a draft requirement of no more than 3 feet, the longships could easily sail up even quite shallow rivers, giving them access to areas that probably considered themselves completely safe from seaborne attack, but they were nowhere near the sea. If you lived far from the coast near a shallow river, well, you had nothing to fear. No warship would be able to get near you. Of course not. Sure, nothing to worry about, lads. We're perfectly safe sitting here beside this little bit of a river here, so we are. Sure, you can walk across that river and only get your arse wet. Safe as houses we are. No, sorry about that. No, you're not. The depth of a wet arse was all a Viking longship needed, as many a town beside a shallow river would come to discover, to their cost. The Norsemen began to establish fortified encampments around the coast called longports, where they could safely berth their ships, thus enabling them to raid from there and then remain and winter in Ireland if they chose to do so, rather than having to return to their bases in Britain or Scandinavia, which was, of course, much more convenient. The first of these were a Norwegian camp on the river Liffey, where modern Dublin stands, and another one at present-day Annagassan in County Louth. An interesting note about the latter location, Annagassan actually, is that a Viking was said to have been left behind when they finally withdrew, missing the boat, quite literally in his case. But apparently he was happy enough to stay where he was. And the natives, surprisingly, were equally happy for him to do so, and he settled down there. Local tradition telling of a seafaring man of Scandinavian appearance and very large, mythic proportions, it was said, who lived in the village and was nicknamed the Bear. Other encampments of the same type were set up at Leixlip, Clondalkin, Strangford, Youghal, Arklow, and Carlingford. The first record of the Vikings remaining for an entire winter in Ireland comes from Loch Ney, the winter of 840 to 841, followed by a permanent settlement that grew into a town on the river Liffey, which they called Difflin, from the Irish Dove Linn, the Dark Pool, which became Dublin, where they spent the winter of 841 to 842. Strange enough, there were actually 2 towns side by side, the Viking Difflin close to the mouth of the river, and an Irish town called Aclea, the Ford of the Hurdles, which lay further upriver. Despite various Irish uprisings and occasional periods of control over the city, the Norse managed to more or less control Dublin right up to the Norman invasion of Ireland in 1169, though by that time they were indistinguishable from the native Irish due to assimilation. Ironically, of course, the Normans were themselves descendants of Vikings, who had settled in France several centuries earlier, which is where their name and the name of Normandy itself came from, originally being known to the Franks as Normanni, or the Northmen. Even before some of the longports had become actual towns, trade had been established, which was typical of Viking expeditions elsewhere as well, since trade and settlement were often as important as raiding. In fact, frequently more so, and of course less costly in casualties. And once these grew into proper towns, that aspect of the Viking occupation became paramount: settlement and trade. Fighting still occurred, of course, between them and various Irish chieftains and local kings whose domain lay outside the areas controlled by the Norse, and that fighting went on for decades, with both sides victorious, depending, well, on who had the greatest strength at the time on the day. The Vikings slaughtering the Irish one day, and the Irish slaughtering the Vikings the next, as well as clashes between rival Viking groups. Oh yes, the Vikings fought each other as well, not just the Irish. See, they're usually seen as the Vikings, which gives the impression they were all on the same side, fighting as one. Vikings, Irish. But they weren't. They were not one unified force. They didn't even all come from one country, being Norwegians and Danes, and maybe a few Swedes thrown in as well. And they comprised a number of factions that vied with one another for power, or fought over blood feuds and the like. Some of these blood feuds probably having actually started back in Scandinavia and brought to Ireland and continued over here. So when they weren't fighting the Irish, they were often fighting each other with equal ferocity. A battle occurred, for example, in 851 AD in Dundalk Bay between rival Danes and Norwegians. And it's interesting to note that it wasn't always just Irish versus Viking or Viking versus Viking either, since some surprising alliances developed between the invaders and the local people. The old saying, "the enemy of my enemy is my friend," certainly applied on a number of occasions in Ireland. Around 969 AD, for example, the Viking king of Waterford entered into an alliance with Brian Boru's brother, Mahon, the over-king of Munster. A rather ironic alliance in view of what would happen a few years later at Clontarf. And the Viking kings of Dyflin made brief alliances with several Irish kings in order to avoid having to fight on two fronts while they were raiding and fighting across the Irish Sea in Britain. It was much better to have Irish friends, even if only temporary ones, at their back rather than enemies. There were other alliances, of course, some only temporary, while others lasted, depending on the circumstances. Many Irish leaders also realized the financial and social benefits to be had by alliances with the Norse, given their remarkably efficient and widespread trading activities, bringing in goods from Britain, Scandinavia, and as far afield as the Mediterranean, produce the Irish had no access to in any other way. National pride took second place quite often to political or social expediency, and trading relationships quickly developed, which in turn led to a personal interchange of ideas and aspects of each other's culture. That in turn led to marriage in many cases. The popular image of a constant them versus us is really quite incorrect in the context of Norse and Irish relations, especially once the Viking settlements became permanently established and their raids into the countryside diminished. I think a lot of that had to do with the fact that very few Irish petty kings and chieftains would have seen an alliance to Ireland as a country. Their allegiances were to their own little kingdoms, which caused any number of local wars between them as well, fighting each other for power and land as well as fighting the Vikings. And once they discovered that the Vikings were not going to conquer the entire country and thus threaten their own little bits of it, the advantages of trade and profit for themselves, plus the considerable benefit of having the Vikings as war allies if needed, outweighed other considerations. Saving dear old Mother Ireland from the invaders was not their concern as long as their parts of it remained unthreatened, and it was other chieftains who were suffering, especially if those other chieftains happened to be enemies of theirs. And trading relations rather than fighting were of course the best guarantee of preserving their own lands without loss to themselves. And the Vikings, naturally, were perfectly happy to get what they wanted without having to fight for it. And, of course, acquiring valuable allies into the bargain, plus being able to live more securely in their settlements, able to concentrate on farming and raising families, rather than constant warfare. I mean, contrary to a popular belief that the Vikings enjoyed nothing but fighting, actually they generally preferred farming and things like that. It's worth noting, by the way, that once the Vikings had settled down and established towns, those people living in the towns were, strictly speaking, no longer Vikings. They were simply Norse, or you could call them Danes or Norwegians. The term Viking or Vikinger in Old Norse only applied to one who got in a ship, went somewhere in that ship, and did something when they got, wherever it was they got to, be it raiding, trading, exploring, scratching their arse or whatever. But once they were settled residents of a town, not having anything whatsoever to do with ships or raiding, just ordinary people going about normal domestic activities, farming, craftsmanship of all kinds, having children and so on, they were no longer Vikings in the strict sense of that word. Even when they fought against the Irish, as long as they were settled people defending their towns or settlements, for example, not leaping off ships to do it, they weren't actually Vikings. They were simply settlers, townspeople, fighting off enemies. It's a subtle difference, perhaps, but true nonetheless, though I suppose we are stuck with the term Vikings, given its popular, though frequently incorrect usage. One Olaf the White became King of Dublin circa 853 AD, reigning jointly with a very famous Viking indeed, perhaps one of the most famous of all Vikings, his kinsman, Ivar Ragnarsson, better known as Ivar in Bainlausi, or Ivar the Boneless, supposedly the son of Ragnar Lothbrok and Oslo, well known, of course, to any fans of the Vikings TV show, though the portrayal of him in that, he ravaged County Meath to begin with, plundering Celtic tombs, such as those famous ones in the Boyne Valley, and he was involved in no little conflict with native Irish chieftains for quite some time. Then he and Olaf left Dublin in 865, along with Ivar's brother Ubba, to head the Great Heathen Army, along with a number of other Norse leaders, of course, and to conquer much of Britain. It was the largest Norse army ever to land in England, and the most successful, eventually gaining the Norsemen full control over most of that country. They captured the city of York, or Jorvik to the Vikings, in 866 AD, fought their way through Mercia, and wintered in Nottingham in 868, and defeated King Edmund in East Anglia in 869. Olaf had returned to Dublin fairly soon, with Ivar himself returning to Ireland in 871, a few years before his death. He's said to have died around 873, though it's hard to be sure, leaving the Great Heathen Army to continue fighting in England for several more years. They had already either fully or partially conquered every English kingdom except Wessex, where King Alfred the Great had initially paid them to go away, which of course they didn't. After managing to defeat the Norse in a battle in 878 and not wanting to risk further fighting, which he had no actual guarantee of winning, King Alfred wisely agreed a treaty with them that granted them rulership over most of northern England, which came to be called the Danelaw, in respect for their agreement to leave his own kingdom of Wessex alone, rather turning his seeming victory over the Norse into at least a partial victory for them. After all, while he saved Wessex, they got pretty much the rest of England. I think most commanders would regard that as a victory. And while Alfred's saving of Wessex did lay the groundwork that would eventually lead to the Saxon reconquest of England, he can't really be credited with it, though he frequently is in history books. And it was actually a woman who began it. One of the greatest rulers pre-Norman England ever had, Alfred's daughter, the amazing Ethelfled of Mercia, who, clad in chainmail, led her army against the Danes. The Lady of Mercia, as she was known, recapturing large sections of the Danelaw, which her father, of course, never did. But let us return to Ivar. Ivar the Boneless founded the greatest of the Viking dynasties in Ireland, or anywhere else for that matter, known as the Eivs, meaning the descendants of Ivar, though that title included Ivar himself and his contemporaries. And he would have derived considerable wealth from the slave trade, there being enormous profits to be had both from the international trade in slaves itself, often sent as far as Francia or Constantinople, and from heavy taxes levied on it. He was described as the King of the Norsemen of all Ireland and Britain, a very modest title that he may actually have given to himself. Well, why not? Clearly he deserved it. And he was considered a brilliant military strategist, something the TV show does portray correctly. He could indeed include Britain in his claim, since the Norse Kingdom of Dublin included a considerable area along the west coast of Britain and Scotland, as well as the Hebrides. Now, whether or not he was actually crippled to any great extent is a matter of debate, given his military prowess, and he was described as being a very large man, standing well above most others, and a capable warrior. There's really no way to give a definite answer. given the conflicting accounts of him. Nor are there any Anglo-Saxon reports of anyone ever meeting him and describing him physically, though I'm sure many Anglo-Saxons did meet him. How many were still alive afterwards to talk about it, of course, is another matter. Some saga accounts describe him as having weak bones or cartilage instead of bone and having to be carried, though the Ragnarssonarþátr, the tale of Ragnar's sons, suggests male impotence, that his bonelessness was simply figurative, and in that case tales of his physical handicap may well have been an attempt to hide that rather embarrassing fact. Though Ivar did exist, unlike Ragnar Lothbrok, who is seemingly a combination of several men, and his brothers Bjorn Ironside and Ubba are also historical figures, a great deal of Ivar's story is partly historical fact and partly saga storytelling, which may or may not be correct. But regardless of whether he couldn't walk properly or simply couldn't get it up, as they say, let us leave the fearsome Ivar and continue with the Viking activities elsewhere in Ireland. Very intense Norse settlement began around the year 914 AD, with numerous longports popping up around the Irish coast. Some of them went on to become principal cities, among them Limerick, Wexford, Waterford and Cork. Now the latter, Cork, is most interesting, since there was a monastic settlement there which went on living quite happily, unharmed, side by side with the Viking settlement, the monks actually obtaining hard-to-get foreign goods from the Norsemen. They were very probably the only monks in Ireland who actually welcomed the sight of the dragon ships approaching, not having to hastily grab anything of value they could and run and hide in a round tower. Or did they? Now there's the thing. The Irish round tower, a very famous object. Basically a tall, thin, cylindrical stone structure with a pointed top, averaging between 59 feet and 130 feet high, with an entrance doorway accessed by a ladder 10 feet or more above the ground. Some 120 of these towers are thought to have been built, most of those that survive being in varying degree of ruin. And there are also 2 in Scotland and 1 on the Isle of Man, their purpose having been seen as defensive, being built because of the Viking raids, giving the monks warning of approaching raiders by a lookout posted in the towers, and then providing safety for them and whatever valuables they could grab, getting into the tower and pulling up the ladder. The door was too high to be easily broken or set on fire, and even had the raiders got inside, the monks would have gone up higher into the tower, pulling up the access ladders with them. Well, that all seems to make sense. But is it true? Or just another myth, like the Vikings' horned helmets, which of course they never actually wore? Well, the Irish word for them translates as bell house, suggesting they were actually intended for use as, well, a bell tower, a belfry. And it has been pointed out that they have very shallow foundations for such high structures. They're not particularly solid on the ground, so that an entrance door at ground level would affect the structural integrity of the building. That being the reason for its being placed further up, rather than from any defensive intention. Some are not placed in a position where they command any view of the approaches, and couldn't have provided a warning if 20 men were sitting in the top of the tower keeping a lookout. And in any case, once the Vikings found out that the monks took their valuables into the towers, would they not simply bring a ladder on the next raid? A ladder would have been easily carried across the 2 cradles that held the sail when it was lowered, or indeed lashed to the mast. Once up to the tower door, they could smash it in, throw kindling and wood into the tower and set it on fire. And since the structure was basically a big chimney, the smoke and heat would go straight up through it, forcing anyone above to come down, or even setting the upper wooden platforms alight. Now, I'm sure monks did run to the towers on occasions. They would, after all, delay the Viking raiders, even if they did try to get into them, and possibly give the local Irish chieftain time to gather men and come to the rescue. And obviously, well, monks would be safer inside the towers than out in the open. But the towers were purposely built for defense against the Vikings, or that monks took all their valuables into them. Well, that seems highly unlikely. Now, going into the towers and leaving the valuables outside, well, that would have made sense, giving the monks personal protection and not giving the raiders any reason to follow them. But taking valuables into the towers? Gold and silver artifacts, jewels, monetary donations from the faithful, the very thing the Vikings had come for, would have given the raiders a reason to force their way in, and an incentive to devise a quick method of entry. Listen to me now, Vikings. We're going to put all the treasure and money and stuff and gold and all the stuff you've come for into this tower thingy here, and then we're going to go in, pull up the ladder, so we are, and sit in there till you lot all go away. Sorry you fellas had all the trouble of coming here for nothing. Goodbye to you, and may the road rise before you. No, hardly likely, hardly. So all in all, it seems much more likely that the towers were actually little more than belfries. A possible refuge in an emergency, to be sure, but that was not their intended purpose, and definitely not a place to put anything worth taking, unless you wanted somebody to follow you straight in. Oddly enough, the high entrance door on the round towers was placed in line with the west doorway of whatever church was nearby. Why, I have absolutely no idea, and I don't think anyone else does either. But that fact has been used by archaeologists to find the location of vanished churches, where nothing of them remains visible above ground. Another interesting example of something that may not be quite as we thought it is the fact that Vikings may have come to Ireland well before they began raiding, come as traders. Something those who wrote the Annals of Ulster, for example, wouldn't have probably bothered recording. After all, traders from elsewhere wouldn't have been uncommon. Not so long ago, 4 Viking graves were discovered in Dublin's South Great George's Street. Well, nothing very odd about that. Many such graves have been found all over Dublin. But when the archaeologist in charge had the remains dated, she was astonished to discover that these men had been buried long before Dublin was founded, before the first recorded Viking raids. And this does suggest that trading vessels had preceded the dragon ships. Perhaps early raiders had even obtained useful information from those very traders as to the location of wealthy monasteries. That's entirely possible. I'm sure they would have asked people who had already been there, well, where's the best place to go? Where do they have all the money? Intermarriage and cultural exchanges between the Irish and the Norse became more frequent as time went on, many Norse converting to Christianity. And after a time, it became really hard to tell a Norse man or woman from their Irish counterparts. Sigurd Olafsson, Silkbeard as he was known, a late 10th and early 11th century king of Dublin, is a good example of the joining of Gael and Norse, his father a Norse nobleman and his mother an Irish princess. A common form of union by that time. And as a Christian, he founded Dublin's Christchurch Cathedral circa 1028, the oldest surviving building in the city as it happens, though Sigurd's original building was made of wood, and he went on a pilgrimage to Rome. Even as early as 1014 AD, Irish and Norse had become so intertwined in marriage, commerce, and religion, many former pagans by that time being Christians, that the Norse and the Dublin Irish fought together against the usurping King Brian Boru at the Battle of Clontarf. Brian was not, as Irish schoolchildren were taught for many years, trying to drive the savage, ungodly pagans from Ireland, since most of the pagans were Christians anyway. No, he was a land grabber, whose only interest was taking the Kingdom of Dublin for himself, regardless of who controlled it, Gael or Norse. I'm sorry, schoolchildren of Ireland, Brian Boru was no hero. No. Sorry about that. The Norse influence on Ireland was immense, bringing new ideas and things like a proper monetary system, for example. The already mentioned King Sigurd Olafsson founded the first Irish mint around 997 AD, minting proper Irish coins for the first time, rather than using Anglo-Saxon or even Arab ones, had been done previously. Admittedly, they were copies of the English coins, but they were actually produced here in Ireland, each one made of silver and worth 1 penny, being a pennyweight, as it was called, which was a 240th part of a pound. The Norse founded towns, brought advanced military technology and weapons, and exposed Ireland to international trade on a scale impossible previously. Norse influence, after all, extended across half the known world, stretching from Greenland to Baghdad, the countries that lay around the Mediterranean Sea, to Russia, a land that actually took its name from them, local people calling them the Rus. And they had frequent access to the greatest centre of trade in the world, Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire. The extent of their trading is well illustrated by the fact that large numbers of Islamic and even Indian items are found in Scandinavia. Over 200,000 Arab silver coins alone having been discovered in Norse burial sites. Now, I mentioned slaves already. Slaves were a very important part of Viking raids in the early days, and continued to be, even after they had established themselves. And Ireland was one of the last countries in Europe, as it happens, to abolish the practice of slave trading, despite the later efforts of the Church to stop it. There had been slaves in Ireland, of course, long before the Viking times. Oh yes, even in the land of saints and scholars, in Holy Ireland, there were slaves. But they were largely prisoners of war, or those who were enslaved for committing various crimes. And slavery itself, of course, was common in the rest of Europe, but the Vikings made it into a lucrative business venture rather than merely a form of punishment, something it hadn't been previously in Ireland. And the country became a centre of the trade, eventually emerging as the largest slave market in Western Europe, centred on Dublin and obtaining the goods, for want of a better word, both from the Irish hinterland and from raids on nearby Britain and Scotland. Excavations in Dublin have turned up long slave chains designed to fasten groups of people together, and individual collars that could be locked around someone's neck. Not really the sort of fashion accessory one would want to wear. But the slave trade should not be seen as any particular bad reflection on the Norse as such, since everyone else was doing it too, and they were simply supplying a demand, as good businessmen do. If they hadn't done it, someone else would have. Well, actually, of course, someone else was, but the Norse just did it better. A great deal of interesting information about the Norse in Ireland was discovered during archaeological excavations in Cork City during 2003 to 2005, which showed that they were exporting animal hides to Europe and importing wine from Francia, that they reclaimed land from the River Lee, stabilizing the swampland by driving large split oak beams into the ground to make it suitable for housing. And they even recycled wooden planks from old unserviceable longships to build jetties in the harbour. The foundations of 19 wooden houses were discovered, dated to around 1070 AD. The Norse were highly accomplished metalworkers, merchants, tradesmen, and tradeswomen. Many Norse women have been found buried with scales and weights, indicating their profession as merchants, as well as being skilled farmers and builders. Some parts of their wooden buildings actually held together without nails, relying on the pressure of one plank against another. And they brought many of these skills to Ireland, of course, which would influence the native craftsmen and artisans. Perhaps their greatest achievement, though, was as shipbuilders, the Viking Longship being a masterpiece of construction, the most advanced warship of its day, indeed one of the finest ship designs in history. And that gave them the ability to not only cross oceans, but sail up rivers deep inland, using the rivers of Europe to travel from the Baltic down to the Black Sea and Constantinople, often porting their ships overland, and, as we've seen, to raid right into the Irish countryside with ease. No town that lay on a river with a depth of 3 feet or more was safe from the longships, no matter how far inland they might be. And since the keel of a longship was the same at both ends, should it come under, say, arrow attack from the riverbank or be faced with a blockage across the river, the rowers could simply turn around, face the opposite way, and then the ship could reverse direction almost instantly. Aspects of Norse shipbuilding methods and designs, like everything else, also found their way into Irish ships, particularly a type known as a yawl, which is an ancient type of quite small craft found around Achill Island off the coast of County Mayo. Originally, yawls were pointed at both ends, like a Viking longboat, and built in the Northern European style, and they are regarded as having been inspired by the Viking ships, making them a living link today with the Vikings in Ireland. Now, it should be remembered, however, that the legendary longship was only one type of Norse ship, a custom-designed warship. That was its purpose. And there were other types of ships in use at the same time, specialist cargo vessels, for example, using just a sail, only having a couple of oars for manoeuvring in harbour, and useless for raiding purposes, far too slow. There were quite small trading boats that could be easily ported from one river to another, since it was often necessary to take your boat from this river and carry it overland and put it into that river to continue your journey. And of course, trying to drag a massive longship overland would have been rather awkward, to say the least. Only the longships, though, would have been fitted with dragon or sea serpent heads on their prows, or shields hung along the sides. They were the prerogative of the warships, not the trading vessels. And those heads would actually have been removed when approaching friendly harbours, so as not to frighten the landvertier, the spirits that protected the land. As I've said, Norse influence on Ireland was considerable. There are traces of that everywhere today in this country, especially with regard to names. Many Irish surnames being either of Norse origin or representing Irish descriptive names for them. The Norse themselves, of course, had no hereditary surnames until late in the 18th century. In the Viking times, a surname was simply your father's name, with son or daughter added on, known as Patronymics. For example, the very famous Viking Eric the Red had 2 children, a son called Leif and a daughter, Freydis. their surnames being Eriksson and Eriksdottir, respectively, a naming system still used in Iceland and the Faroe Islands, incidentally. Irish names with Norse connections include MacBurney, which means the son of Bjorn, MacManus, the son of Magnus, MacAuliffe, the son of Olaf, and Reynolds, which comes from Ragnar. Then we find descriptive names, such as Doyle, for example, coming from the Irish dove, dark, and Gal, a foreigner, meaning the son of the dark foreigner, or in other words, the son of a Dane, the Norwegians having been referred to as the fair foreigners. Any name ending in son is probably of Norse origin, as are Magna, Halpin, Broderick, Coppinger, Grimes, Harold, Cotter, Trant, Crangle, Braniff, Houston, Kenrick, Kett, Kirby, Broder, Gaynor, Boland, Crosby, Rourke, Handrick and Hendrick, Stoney, Tuke, Thunder, Harford, Grimes, Killen, and Dromgool. Town names that end in Ford indicate a Norse origin, from the word fjord, meaning an inlet. Waterford, Carlingford, Strangford, Wexford, for example. And the County Dublin coastal town of Skerries takes its name from an old Norse word meaning a rock in the sea. There's a rocky outcrop into the sea beside the town. So the Norse are still very much with us today in Ireland. Many things commonly thought of as being Irish actually having their origins in Scandinavia. Many words in the Irish language actually come from Old Norse. A very interesting Norse legacy is the area of Dublin known as Oxmantown, which lies north of the River Liffey, where once stood a settlement founded by Norse Gaels, who were known as Ostmen or Eastmen, rather than the fully native Gaels, who were referred to as the Vestmen or Westmen. The settlement, Ostmanatun, the homestead of the Eastmen, distinct district of Dublin for centuries, even after the city spread out across the river to the north, its name gradually being corrupted to Oxmantown, as it is today. But the Norse influence is still apparent just by looking at the street names. I actually lived in that district for quite a while. And there you'll find Ivor Street, as it's pronounced here, Harold Road, Ostman Place, Olaf Road, Sigurd Road, Thor Place, Viking Road, Viking Place, Oxmantown Road, and Citric Road. Sadly, however, much of the Norse heritage in Dublin City has been lost, and not just names, but actual buildings from that era, thanks to an astonishing lack of interest and care by those who should have preserved it. The area of Dublin City known as Wood Quay, lying on the south bank of the River Liffey close beside Christchurch Cathedral, was chosen by the Dublin City Corporation in the early 1970s as the site for new civic offices. But when they began to clear it to commence the construction, an amazing spectacle was unearthed. They had discovered Difflin. It was a fantastic archaeological treasure, a complete section of a Viking town. Complete. The virtually intact foundations of dozens of houses, storage buildings, yards, streets and pathways paved with wooden planks laid side by side. The quayside that would have lain on the bank of the river 1,000 years before, and buildings that probably housed the goods brought in by the ships that would have been tied up there. Nothing quite like it, so extensive and beautifully preserved, had ever been found previously in Ireland, and seldom anywhere else either, even in Scandinavia. And it astonished and horrified everyone when the city fathers decided to proceed with the civic office project, though they agreed to wait for the site to be examined by archaeologists. Oh, how very nice of them. Thank you, city fathers. For what? Additional studies were made of the site. Archaeological excavations were carried out by the National Museum of Ireland from 1974 to 1981, but then they were halted for construction to begin. Public anger was extensive, especially after the High Court declared the entire site to be a national monument, and thus, under the law, protected from any development. A national monument could not be touched. But the developers took advantage of a loophole in the law to get around the court order. Oh, those legal loopholes. And they went ahead with their construction plans. Thousands of people protested in the streets. "Save Wood Quay!" became a rallying cry across the city. I remember it well. Never before had there been public protests on such a large scale, with many prominent figures joining in, but to no avail. Though thousands of artifacts were recovered and taken to the museum, the wonderful buildings weren't even moved a bit at a time to another site, something which was possible. It was done in Egypt, for example, with much larger structures. Massive statues of pharaohs, entire temples, for example, being moved a stone at a time. But no, the buildings of Viking Dublin were destroyed, and Dyflin vanished beneath the new civic offices, destroyed not by war or time, but by those whose duty it had been to preserve it, a duty which they sadly lacked. Times have changed, of course. Something on that scale wouldn't happen these days. But that is of little benefit to a wonderful national treasure now lost forever. It was a dreadful archaeological crime, the destruction of a significant part of Dublin's history that had been beautifully preserved for over 1,000 years. Should you ever visit Dublin, don't miss a permanent exhibition called Dublinia, housed in a building attached to Christchurch Cathedral, which gives a fascinating account of Viking and medieval Dublin through artifacts, beautiful models of the city at various periods in its history, reconstructed houses and shops, as well as hands-on items such as helmets and weapons, and guides dressed in period costume. It does seem very sad to me, however, that one can see a small reconstruction of Viking Dublin under a glass case, only a couple of hundred yards from where one could have seen the actual town itself. The civic offices are hardly a substitute, nicknamed by Dubliners the bunkers, which, given their resemblance to the huge flak towers in Berlin during World War II, seems rather appropriate. One very interesting discovery has been made as recently as the beginning of 2018, however, when workers digging the foundations for a new hotel discovered the well-preserved remains of a Hiberno Norse village. Houses with gardens and cobbled streets, part of what would have been a small outlying village beyond the city walls. Numerous artifacts have been recovered from the late Hiberno Norse period, as well as from later centuries, and it is the intention of the hotel developers to preserve the site, in stark contrast to the Wood Quay fiasco. That, at least, is good news. As I said at the start, without the Viking raids and their later settlements, medieval Ireland would have been a very different place, as would the Ireland that came to be later on, their influence on the country and its subsequent history being enormous. They influenced every aspect of Irish life in some way or another, cultural and political, economically and militarily, brought new ideas and ways of doing things, and the Ireland of today owes them a great deal for what the country has become. A genetic study in January of 2018 discovered a considerable DNA trace, far larger than had previously been thought, which has led to the suggestion that the Norse left an even greater impact on Ireland than was previously thought. And without them, the course of Irish history would have been different. Well, maybe better or maybe worse, we have no way of knowing, but it certainly would have been different. Celtic and Norman Saxon influences alone driving the country without the Norse contribution. Indeed, it's fair to say that the Norse influence on Ireland was greater than it was in any of the other lands where they settled, with the exception, of course, of Normandy, and possibly to a lesser extent the regions of present-day Russia that were settled by the Norse known as the Rus, though Slavic influence was extensive in that region. Iceland, though so obviously Norse in very many ways, doesn't really count, since there was no established culture there prior to the arrival of the Norse settlers, and it was they who were solely responsible for Iceland's culture, something that is very evident even today, the Icelandic language being extremely close to Old Norse, with many words being exactly the same, and others similar enough that Eric the Red would still understand reasonably well what the Icelanders were saying if you could bring him down to our own age in a time machine. Well, that concludes this look at the Viking connections with Ireland. I hope you enjoyed it, and until next time, let me just say farewell. Bye for now.